All right. So I'm going to start off right away just by apologizing because everything went wrong last week. We didn't have our slides, and then I didn't even record it. And so we lost last week entirely. So we're going to do a heavy review today. So if you feel like, well, I already heard this stuff, I apologize. I hope that the review will be helpful, especially now that we have the slides to go along with the review. So we're going to do a heavy review. I'm still going to attempt to get to new material, so it won't be just a review class. Get into the new material and start answering the question of, well, what are the arguments for this different canons? So without further ado, we'll get into this, starting with where we picked off last week. This will probably be the quicker part of the review. Let's see where you want to go. Oh boy, I thought I remembered what slide I was supposed to go to, but I'm looking at these and these don't look right. All right, we're gonna go to 68. Nope, that's too far back. And we already did all the oral tradition stuff. So I think, here we go. 86. Dyslexia. I thought 68. All right, 86. All right, so recognizing the canon, that's how we picked up a few weeks ago. We're going way back by covering this, so I'm just going to briefly move through this. We're just talking about how the essentially what we started talking about in this section were editorial additions being made to the existing canon and how those were received. And so we went through Deuteronomy. We talked about his death. We're not going to cover all this again. We talked about Moses giving his authority to Joshua, and so is likely, in my opinion, the best candidate for these later additions into Deuteronomy. And prior would probably be done by Joshua. It's possible, as we talked about, that it could have been Ezra. This little meme here, Moses talking about him being the most humble man on the earth. The second slide, you probably aren't recognizing that one with Obama giving himself the Medal of Honor, is you can thank the Harlans there. They suggested that this meme go up here. So I added it because I thought it was fitting. But yeah, so would Moses, who is the most humble man on the earth, tell everybody he was the most humble man on the earth? This would become the paradox, and I would suggest that this was a later addition, probably by Joshua. We talked about John Gill. John Gill introduces to us the possibility of these later additions in his commentary. He introduces it to us in this class, but he is by far not the first person to talk about this throughout church history. This is a very common view in church history, that it would have been either Joshua or Ezra. This is held throughout long time. So it's not a new view that came up in the 1700s. He's just retelling it. We talk about Joshua writing the Torah again, potentially giving the second edition, if you will, but not just the second edition, but the second copy of the Torah. And going back to Gill, going back to later editions that we talked about as well. Joshua writing the name of Jerusalem here is highly unlikely. Jerusalem would not have been in his vocabulary. Instead, he would have been talking about the Jebusites or Jebus as the city, that the name, you don't get the name Jerusalem until David conquers the Jebusite city. And this is the last time, as we went through the slides, we went through the different parentheticals where it would say, this is the Jebusite slope or the city of Jebus, which is also called Jerusalem, these parenthetical statements that would have been added. And then you get the flip in Chronicles, you get David marching to Jerusalem, and then the parenthetical is, which is also Jebus. And this is the last time this parenthetical statement occurs, because this is when Jerusalem is named Jerusalem, is when David conquers it. So you don't get that parenthetical anymore after David conquers Jerusalem. That's just to demonstrate when the name change officially occurred. And then we get 1 Samuel 9:9, where we see the later editor telling us that the word for prophet and seer, the word seer is now an archaic term. We no longer use the word seer, we use the word prophet. This wouldn't have occurred in Samuel's day. This would have occurred in a later time frame. You can track the word seer throughout the Old Testament as late as Amos. So then the question is, it's got to be someone after Amos who would have seen that language change occur and record it. This too, you've got Proverbs 25:1. These two are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah of Judah copied. Like I said, when I introduced this, there's a lot of people who want to spend time on trying to figure out who the men of Hezekiah are who copied this. I think that's a less important question to me because everyone was authorized to copy the Bible, but not everyone was authorized to add this verse. And so with this verse, who added the verse? Who suggested that we needed this verse to begin with? So it would have to have been someone after Hezekiah who's introducing a verse into the book of Proverbs that Solomon wrote. We know Solomon wrote the book, but Hezekiah is a few hundred years after Solomon. So Solomon couldn't have written this verse. He wouldn't have known who Hezekiah was. And so this would have been a later addition. And it was put here clearly to tell the people that you may not be familiar with the following Proverbs. And so you need to know who the author of these Proverbs are. So this would have been potentially maybe have lost to time and refound. And then they said, hey, we need to tell the people that these two are the Proverbs of Solomon, because they are not as familiar with these ones as the previous 25. So then we go back to Gil. And so we talked about Joshua, and now we wanted to talk about why Ezra. Why is Ezra the other option for these later editions? And as I said before, it's possible that there were other editors of the Old Testament as the Old Testament was written, but generally speaking, most of these additions are going to be attributed to Ezra. And so we needed to know why Ezra would be the one who was given these attributions. And so we went through just a brief history of the Old Testament, if you will, but primarily where these writers of the Old Testament were going to be. And so we started with Moses around 1400 BC, and then 400 years later, we had David. And then about 400 years again later, we had the captivity, and it's where you're going to get some of your prophets like Daniel and Esther and a lot of those ones. And then you get to the Second Temple period around 200 years after the captivity, when the temple is going to be rebuilt. At that point, we're introduced to a couple of very necessary people to know about this time period. One of them is Ezra. And now Ezra had determined in his heart to study the law of the Lord Yahweh, obey it, and teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. So here we got Ezra. We've got the temple being built, and he needs to now learn the law, relearn it, and study it, and then teach it to the people, because he wants to reinstitute the ceremonial practices that were lost when the temple was destroyed initially. But now that the temple's back, let's bring this stuff back. He wants to make sure he does it right. Obviously, when you do it wrong, you end up with a David situation where you move the Ark of the Covenant and someone dies when you do it wrong. So he wants to make sure you do it right. And so he's going to learn it, and he's going to teach it to the people. Contemporary with Ezra, you have Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah's day, this is you need to understand the setting that's occurring in Nehemiah's day. In those days, I also saw the Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, but could not speak Hebrew. I rebuked them, cursed them, beat some of their men, and pulled out their hair. And so this was a big deal, that half the people were illiterate to the language of Hebrew. They knew other languages, but not Hebrew. And so Nehemiah is seeking to correct this issue, and he's rebuking them for that. So what do we have here is we have a bunch of people who need to learn the law that don't know the language it was written in. And it says that they knew the language of Ashdod or the language of the other peoples that could not speak Hebrew. The lingua franca, that's just to say the common language of this day, Nehemiah and Ezra, is Aramaic. That is what everyone was speaking. That was the common language for all people here, was Aramaic. So when Nehemiah 8, 1 and 8 are written, it says, all the people are gathered together at the square in front of the water gate. They asked the scribe Ezra, that's the Ezra we read about earlier, to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had given Israel. They read out of the book of the law of God, translating and giving the meaning so people could understand what was read. This is really important in understanding what's occurring here. Remember, the people didn't speak Hebrew, so they had to translate it into Aramaic, probably. I'm assuming it was Aramaic because that was the lingua franca. So that's what they translated it into. Plus, we have good evidence here of what occurred in this day. This was a big shift in the Hebrew language, not the language itself per se, although the language itself had already been adjusted. But if you remember this chart, this particular chart, we talked about this when we talked about Moses coming out of Egypt, and he's getting ready to write the Torah, right? He's coming out, he's going to write the Torah. He writes in Hebrew, but what was his writing system? We spent many weeks developing the different writing systems that came about, when they were, where they were, and so on. So the alphabet Moses would have used to write what we call Paleo-Hebrew would have been in the Phoenician alphabet. Now, what changes in Ezra's day is the Aramaic script. So the Aramaic script, it's what we call the Hebrew square script, or the Aramaic square script, not the Hebrew square script. This would be what we are commonly know as Hebrew today. But the Aramaic square script developed much later, a few hundred years, roughly 500 years later, the Aramaic square script pops up in history. And this is the language this is the alphabet, the writing alphabet that Ezra would have used to now rewrite the Old Testament. Not rewrite it as in like it was brand new, never seen before. I made the case last week that these sorts of changes in language happen organically, and they happen over a period of time. So this would have been something that was already being done, that the Hebrews already would have been using the square script. Ezra wouldn't have forced it on the people or changed it. He would have used the system they were already using. What he likely did was just standardize it. This is how we're going to do it from this point going forward. And so this is important because this is where we first get the introduction of a standardized Old Testament, if you will, written in the Aramaic square script instead of the Paleo-Hebrew Phoenician square script. It's still all Hebrew. It's just a different writing system. We talked about this last week too, where the Mongolian, I couldn't remember. I found the article. But the article that I was reading, in which we had a particular language that would write in Arabic, not to be confused with Aramaic. And it was writing in Arabic, and they would write from top to bottom, even though Arabic is generally written from right to left. But they also had right to left Arabic. So they had these two writing systems that were just combined in their culture. People would write top to bottom in like news articles, and left to right on signposts and things of that nature. And so this was just common. And we do the same thing if you think about it in America, though not commonly. We do write signs from top to bottom frequently, but that's not the standard. The standard is from left to right. So they had these two forms that were more standardized, right to left and top to bottom. And the Mongolian government really wanted to, they're kind of unique where they sit. Everyone else around them has a different writing system, and so they wanted to kind of merge, be more unified with at least the government wanted to be more unified with the countries around them. So the government established a new writing system from Latin, right, and left to right. So it was going to be left to right in the Latin letters, still their Mongolian language, but now it's going to be Latin letters instead of Arabic letters. And they imposed it. They're like, this is what we're doing from this point forward. And it lasted for 2 months. because these things happen organically. When you try to force language change on people, it just doesn't work. We talked about it also in the French community, where they're the opposite. They're not trying to force language change. They're trying to prevent language change, and they can't stop it. And they're trying to figure out how to stop it. So in either case, trying to force a language change or trying to prevent language change on a culture will almost always inevitably fail. It just happens organically, and it has to be adapted or adopted. And so here, if you want to understand the arguments that are made from this position that the Hebrew Aramaic square script is developed, standardized, adopted in Ezra's day, these are the books you really need to dig into, especially the first one up on the list, Ada Yardani's The Book of the Hebrew Script. She is probably the leading authority on this issue. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, it was her that they called and said, "What did we find?" And she would open it up, and she was able to recognize the characters, and she knew, oh, you found the Old Testament. And so she was the one that was called in. She's really done a lot of work on demonstrating the history of the Hebrew people and their language, and the script specifically. This is her life's work. It's just specifically the script itself, how it was developed. And then you've got Emmanuel Toe, textual criticism of the Old Testament. This is going to be more about what, we'll get into this. We're not going to get into it right now, but what was the final text form, the actual words. And then this one, the formation of the Hebrew Bible by David M. Carr, another source guy. So these are primary sources. You'll hear people talk about me, for example, talk about how these things came about. These are the primary sources. These are the people doing the work. They're the ones who are in the field doing the work. They're not just teaching it in a classroom. These are what the teachers are teaching in the classroom. So primary sources, I always encourage people to read the primary sources, to find the scholars who are in the work. Their hands are in it. They're doing it every day. David M. Carr and Emmanuel Tove, they're going to talk about a later formation of the Hebrew Bible that's going to take longer than Ezra. My contention is going to be what I set out in the beginning to talk about, is what is the canon, just because there are later editions and things of that nature. And even though they're helpful, my contention, if I say it now, then I'm going to poison the well a little bit, but I'm going to do it anyway, just because they do address this in their books. My contention is that any edition post Ezra would be an unauthorized edition, and anything prior to Ezra would have been authorized by Ezra. And so try not to remember that when I start talking about the arguments from the canon, because I kind of spoiled it for you. So the Old Testament timeline here, so this was the big deal, is so in Moses' day, he's using the Phoenician Paleo-Hebrew script, and then that would have been adopted to, or the Aramaic square script, the Hebrew Aramaic square script that we're all familiar with today, would have been adopted in the Second Temple period. All right. And remember, it's not Ezra just forcing it on people and changing someone's language. It just doesn't work that way. Throughout history, that doesn't happen. It just happens organically, and it's adopted. And since Aramaic was the lingua franca of that day, this is a totally reasonable direction to go to. This is also important to understand, because when Jesus suggests that not one jot or tittle will pass away of the law until all be fulfilled, he's talking about things that didn't exist in Moses's day when he wrote the Torah. He's talking about things that would have been, that Ezra would have updated into. So the jot and tittle, if you understand what those are, the jot, we call it a jot. The J was not initially pronounced, so it would have been the yod or the yot. The yod is the smallest Hebrew letter. It's a consonant. And the tittle is like, I guess the best way to describe the tittle would be like our letter F and our letter T. Our lowercase f, where we've got like a little hook on the top, but it looks like a T otherwise, that little hook would be the equivalent of a tittle. It's a small mark that distinguishes one letter from another letter. That's what a tittle is. It's not a vowel point. Vowel points didn't exist yet. The Yod isn't a vowel point. They didn't exist yet. The vowel pointing system doesn't exist till later. That's another later development in the Hebrew script. Then we talked about what was it that Ezra divided the scriptures up into. We talked about the Tanakh. If you guys remember this, the Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. All right, Torah being law, Nevi'im being the prophets, and Ketuvim being the writings. If you know Hebrew better than I do, you probably heard me butcher all three of those. That's great. You can smack me for it later. I tried. But that's what it is. It's the law, the prophets, and the Torah. These are the three systems, the three divisions that are given their official name, the Tanakh, in the 1800s. That's the official acronym name is in the 1800s, but it's based off of scripture. And that scripture, one of those places is in Luke, where it says that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms are a stand-in here for the writings. But then I wanted to caution you not to suggest that every time you saw writings or the law or the prophets, that you would assume that it's only referring to one section of scripture. Here it's divided into three sections. And so we talked about places where those terms are used to describe the whole Old Testament. So one was in 1 Corinthians 14:21. It says, "It is written in the law, I will speak to this people by people of other tongues and by lips of foreigners, and even then they will not listen to me." And so I said, if it's in the law and you assume that law just means Torah, then you should expect to find this in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy, but you don't. This is a quote from Isaiah, which is not part of the Torah. So here, law is a reference to the whole Old Testament. Also here, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. If you assume that prophets here is just referring to the major and minor prophets of the Old Testament, as you work through the book of Hebrews, he's going to quote all over the place in the entire Old Testament, from the writings and the Torah and the prophets. He's going to quote all over the place, and he's using this as his base where he's jumping from. Prophets here does not refer to just the major and minor prophets or even the people who held the office of prophet, but it refers to the entire Old Testament as a whole. And here I chose the NET translation because of I wanted to just demonstrate the particular word here and how from infancy he's talking to Timothy. Paul's talking to Timothy. You have known the holy writings. You have known the holy writings. So here, the reason why word writings is used here is the underlying Greek word grapha is usually the word that's translated scriptures. In fact, it's almost always actually. Don't quote, I say dogmatic things and then I'm like, there's going to be the exception and someone's going to correct me on it. But I'm nearly certain grapha is always translated scriptures in the Greek. And the word that's here is not grapha, it's gramma. And gramma is a general word for writing, such as receipts and things of that nature. It would be general writings. But in this case, in this context, the holy writings are the equivalent to scripture. So many translations will use the word scriptures here instead of writings, and that's a totally legitimate translation because it's synonymous with writings here, the holy writings. But the NET, the ESV, and a couple others actually use the word writings here, and that's that was just helpful for me to just demonstrate to you that there's the word writings that's referring to the entirety of the Old Testament, not just Psalms and Job and Ecclesiastes and such. Whew. All right, that was the review. Now we can start getting into some of the new material. All right, so what was it? This becomes the question. What is in the three divisions of the Old Testament? The writings, the Torah, and the prophets. What's in those? And that is going to define for us what's in the canon. Once we know what's in there, then we know what's in the canon. So we need to know some of the canon lists. So we'll start with our standard canon, the one that the Protestants use, right? And so this is, you open your Bible right now to your table of contents. This is the canon list that you'll find in the beginning of your Bible. So next we're going to look at the Roman Church canon. the Roman Church canon, this is what's in their Bibles. And as you can see, it's a little bit longer. You'll notice now, I need you to understand something here so you understand what I'm doing. But you'll notice I have the, no, come on, here we go. The number 39 up here for the 39 books of the Old Testament and the number 51 here for the Roman canon. This isn't to suggest that they have 51 or they have additional books that equal 51. They only have 7 additional books. But the reason I write the 51 up there is to help demonstrate how many different writings, because some of these books are combined or are additions to other writings. So I'll describe that more. I'll give you more about that to help you understand why I'm writing these numbers there. It's just to give you a visual of the sections that are different, not necessarily how many books of the Bible are different, if that makes sense. Okay, generally speaking, you're going to hear the argument from the Roman Church that we are missing 7 books of the Bible, and so that number does not correspond to books. Okay, then we have the Eastern Orthodox canon, and you see they have a few more writings than the Roman Church does. And then lastly, we have the Ethiopian canon, which has even more writings than the Eastern Orthodox Church. All right. And as you can see, my font gets smaller and it's going to be more and more difficult for you to read. I'm gonna pick them out for you and help you. And you're going to see that it says 60 plus 35. 60 plus 35. It's not because I couldn't fit the 35 in there. It's because that 35 encompasses one whole other book that they have, which is down at the right here. I put it in bold. It says the rest of the books of the Old Testament. In that book, the rest of the books of the Old Testament are 35 more books. So they have 60 and then 35 more books. And oops, sorry about that. And so then this raises a question. Why am I dealing with these 4 canons? Because as you work through church history, you're going to work through a number of different canon lists. And I chose these 4 primarily because these 4 canon lists are recognized as Christian canons. And they're recognized as Christian canons because they affirm the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, or at least an early version of the Nicene Creed. All 4 of these affirm the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. If you did not affirm the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed in Christendom, in church history, Christian history, you were not recognized as a Christian. You were outside of Christianity. That's not to say necessarily you weren't saved or something of that nature. That's just to say that these were recognized as Christians, both internally and externally. If you didn't affirm those 2 creeds, you weren't Christian. So that's why I chose those 4. Otherwise, I've got to put up there the canon of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I've got to put up there the canon of the Mormons. I've got to put up there the canon of Marcion. I've got to put up there all sorts of heretical canons. You want to see the Gospel of Thomas up there and so many others. Actually, you wouldn't anyway, because that wouldn't be Old Testament, and I'm only showing Old Testament right now. But that being said, when we get to the New Testament, I'd have to start introducing a whole bunch of non-Christian canons. These 4 are considered Christian because they affirm the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. So that's why I'm dealing with these 4. So now, this is really hard for you to tell what I'm working with up here because there's so many names up here. And I did not divide them up in the way the typical Protestant divides them up, where they take the added books and they just put them in between the Old and New Testament. Nope, I put them as they're reflected in their traditions. Okay, so the Roman Church, I put them as reflected in their tradition. The Eastern Orthodox Church, I put them as they're reflected in their canons. And so I'll show you visually as best as I can what the different books are. All right, so here we're going to start with the Roman Church on the left side, and we'll move to the Ethiopian Church on the right side. And what you're going to see here is what's in yellow is what's new compared to the list that's to the left of it. Okay, what's new compared to the list that's to the left of it. So I'm starting with the Protestant canon. As a Protestant, that's my standard, but it's also the common denominator. Everyone accepts this canon. Everyone does. Okay. And so then there's additional books on top of that. Not everyone accepts the additional books. And so those ones will be added. The ones that are in the yellow are additional to the list that's to the left. The ones that are in the kind of darkish red are included in the list to the left. And then they have yellow ones in addition to that, if that makes sense. Okay. All right. So let's go through this. So we've got the prayer of Manasseh here in the Roman church. Now, remember, I said there's 51 up here. The prayer of Manasseh is not its own separate book. You would find the prayer of Manasseh in 2nd Chronicles. Okay. So you can see how these numbers would add up. The prayer of Manasseh is not its own book. It's a section in 2nd Chronicles. That's why. So I'm separating it just so you can visually see the different writings, but that's not considered a whole nother book. All right. Then you see Tobit and Judith. These are separate books. You might be familiar with those. And then you're going to see here, we have Esther, and then we have Esther in Greek. And that's because the Greek Esther is longer than the Hebrew Esther. And so this is not a separate book. These are additions to the book of Esther in Greek that you won't find in the Hebrew Bible, okay? And those are not accepted in the Protestant canon. All right, then you've got Wisdom. Wisdom is the next book. That is its own book. And then Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, okay? These are two separate books. Ecclesiasticus is a book in the Roman church. Then you have the Epistle of Jeremiah, not to be confused with the book of Jeremiah. And you have the book of Baruch. All of these would be found in the book of Jeremiah and Lamentations. In fact, in the Roman church canon, I believe Lamentations is actually part of Jeremiah. They're not separate books. They're one book. Then you have Bel and the Dragon, the Prayer of Azariah, and the Song of the Young Three Men, of the three young men, the three young men there. Those would all be found in the book of Daniel itself. They're not separate books. They're in the book of Daniel. And then at the end, you have 1st and 2nd Maccabees, okay? And so that's the Roman church canon that the Protestants have not recognized, but that the Roman church does. Now we'll move on to the Eastern Orthodox Church. And as you can see, we've got some that are accepted by the Catholic Church. And so we don't need to go over Prayer of Manasseh again. That's already been covered. But they have 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras. And boy, you know, I'll probably cover this one when we get to the Ethiopian. But 1st and 2nd Esdras would be the equivalent of 1st Esdras being the book of Ezra, but the book of Ezra in Greek, which would include the Hebrew Ezra and the Greek Ezra, okay? But it would be, so that's why you don't see 1st Esdras. I probably should have put this in pink. But anyway, then you have 2nd Esdras as well, which the Roman church doesn't have. Then you're going to notice they have one additional psalm. They have 151 psalms, not 150 psalms, okay? And here you're going to have Wisdom, which is the same as Wisdom, but you're going to have Sirach, which is the book of Ecclesiasticus. It's the same book. It's just named differently. The book of Sirach is in Greek. Ecclesiasticus is in Latin. All right. It's the same book, though. You'll also see it called the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, not the Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus, the son of Sirach. Jesus is a common name. And so that's that one. Then you get the Epistle of, we already covered all of those. And then you get 3rd and 4th Maccabees. You get 2 more books of Maccabees that aren't in the Roman church. Moving to the Ethiopian Orthodox, you've got Jubilees and the book of Enoch, okay, that are added into their canon that aren't in any of the canons to the left of them. And this, 1st Ezra, 2nd Ezra, 3rd Ezra, and 4th Ezra, also known as Ezra Sutel. I'm going to tell you my absolute frustration in dealing with all of the canon lists with the book of Ezra, because it is entirely insane. So I'm going to actually refer to my notes just to help me remember what is what. So notice that they're all in yellow, because this 2nd Ezra is not the same as 2nd Esdras, and not entirely same as Esther in Greek, okay? They're all different. So when I'm doing work on stuff and they quote Second Esdras, and I'm not familiar with the books of the canon and what's in them, the books of the Apocrypha and what's in them necessarily, and I go to one Esdras and one of the Esdras or Ezras, and I go to it and I'm like, that's not what's in here. And then I have to go to another one. I'm like, that's not what's in here. And I've exhausted all of the second Esdras, and it's not the second Ezra I'm looking for. So sometimes we'll see this in a later quote, actually in the next quote I show. But sometimes Nehemiah is called second Ezra. Okay, so we have first Ezra and second Ezra, which isn't this Ezra or this second Ezra or this second Ezra. Okay, then we've got let's see. Oh man. Yeah, so we have different Ezras. Nehemiah is a different Ezra, Ezra of Greek, and then this second Ezra right here is sometimes called third Ezra in some writings. And this one is sometimes called fourth Ezra in some writings. And that's why this one gets the name Ezra Sutuel as opposed to the fifth Ezra. And so it just gets a new name for Ezra. And so you've got multiple ways that there's a third Ezra, second Ezra. It's just utterly confusing. And they're not all identical in their writings. The one thing that is identical across the board is the base text Ezra and the base text Nehemiah. Those are identical across the board, but there are later Greek editions and Coptic editions, which are the Ethiopian. And this is entirely confusing. I hated working through this because it was super frustrating. And anyway, it took me forever to figure out what was going on. I was like, why is it? I read this already in third Ezra, but this isn't third Ezra. I'm in second Ezra now. And by the way, Ezra is just Ezra is the Greek name. Esdra is the Hebrew name. Might be the other way around. Let me think here. No, Eastern Orthodox is Greek. So I said it backwards. Ezra is the Hebrew name, and Esdra is the Greek name for the same Hebrew name. So it's the same book, but they go by different names because of whether it's transliterated from Hebrew or transliterated from Greek. Anyway, that was a pain. And so now the question I'm going to seek to answer as we move forward is which of these canon lists are the right ones, right? Obviously, if you've already heard me talking, I've spoiled the well. I'm a Protestant. I affirm the Protestant canon, but I do want to treat fairly at least one other canon list. And so I'm not going to necessarily spend a lot of time on the Eastern Orthodox canon or the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, but I'm going to spend primarily my focus on the Protestant canon and the Roman Church canon. And here's why I'm going to do that. There's something significant that happens in church history that forces Protestants to deal with this issue in this way. And so let's talk about what that change was. And this is the Council of Trent, Session 4 on April 8, 1546. It says, "And it has thought it meet that a list of the sacred books be inserted in this decree, lest a doubt may arise in anyone's mind which are the books that are received by this synod. They are set down here below. Of the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, to wit, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua is that next one there. If you're following along here, we got, let's see, where are we? Joshua right here. It's just a different spelling. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 4 books of Kings. All right, actually, let me go back to this canon list real quick because you probably noticed this as well. That in Eastern Orthodox, you got 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, 3rd Kings, and 4th Kings. Okay, this is the same thing as 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. Those are the same 4 books. They're just named differently. Okay, and you'll see that change in different canon lists. So going back to this, so here we've got the 4 books of the Kings. Okay, that's what I just listed to you. And then you've got 2 of Parapolomenon, which is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The same thing. Okay, this is just the I believe it's the Latin transliteration of the Hebrew. Okay, we have the Greek transliteration in our Bibles. We'll talk about that more later. the first book of Esdras, and the second, which is entitled Nehemiah. So as you can see, this was actually really helpful to me when I read this. I was like, oh, okay, that's why I keep going to Nehemiah every time someone in church history is quoting Second Ezra, and I end up finding myself in Nehemiah. All right. Tobias, Judith, Esther, Job, the Davidical Psalter. Notice that they put the Davidical Psalter because they're eliminating that 51st Psalm, that 151st Psalm. They're saying that's not canon, okay? The Davidical Psalter consisting of 150, right? They're just making it clear. There's not 151st one. All right, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Canticle of Canticles, that's our Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. Wisdom, we already talked about that one. Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. Isaiah, Jeremiah, with Baruch. Okay, so that's the addition there. Ezekiel, Daniel, the 12 minor prophets, to wit, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I didn't try to pronounce it the way that it's written because I wanted you to see the equivalent there. Okay. And then 2 books of the Maccabees, the first and second. All right. So, that is the canon list that happens in Trent. And that would be all well and good if it weren't for this next section. But if anyone not receive as sacred the canonical and as sacred and canonical the said books entire with all their parts, as they have been used and read in the Catholic Church, as they are contained in the Old Latin Vulgate edition, and knowingly and deliberately contemn the traditions aforesaid, let him be anathema. Let all therefore understand what is, in what order and in what manner, said the Synod, after having laid the foundation of the confession of faith, will proceed, and the testimonies and authorities will mainly use it in confirming dogmas and in restoring the morals of the Church. All right, this effectively closes the canon for the Catholic Church, for the Roman Catholic Church. They, and I'll deal with other councils such as Hippo and Carthage that were early in history, and I will deal with the atheist claims that the canon was established at Nicaea. That's not true, or that it was established by one person. That's not the case. But Council of Trent in 1546 did something that was unprecedented in church history. They anathematized anyone who didn't affirm a particular canon. Up to this point, there were canon lists, like I just said, that contained all 4 views that we posted up there through church history. But this is the first time one church has said to another church, you're anathematized. Now, what does that mean? So an anathema, OED, the best way to talk about this is to go to the OED and go to a time period around when the Synod was written. So here's roughly 1548. Synod was in 1546. So this is a good time period. In the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, a person or thing cursed by ecclesiastical authority and excommunicated or assigned to damnation. Now, this is not an either or. This is excommunication, also known as assigned to damnation. So here's the thing. The Roman Church at this point essentially said, if you don't affirm our canon, you're going to hell. This is damnation for you by not affirming our canon. And so all of these lists here, Eastern Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, and the Protestant, all of us, according to the Roman Church, are anathematized. We're all going to hell for not affirming their canon. And so this forces us, particularly as Protestants, to answer this objection. And that's what we're going to seek to do as we move forward in answering what is the canon list. Okay? If the Roman Church hadn't have done this, there would be the ability to have more unity around this subject with some humility. And I'll demonstrate that was the position of the churches throughout church history, that this was an issue of humility and some liberty all throughout church history until the Council of Trent. And so we'll deal with that next week. You guys are all dismissed. Canon.
A Canon in different sets.
Yep.
Are there differences?
I'm gonna show, yeah, that's what we're gonna, that's where we're going.
Oh, okay,
Yep, we're going there.
okay.
Yep, they aren't Christian in this sense. That's why I didn't include them.
Right,
But they
right.
are important to determine the Christian canon.
Yes, okay.
And we're gonna go there.
Great. Alrighty.
Yep.